It's been a long-running debate in journalism circles when to use the term civil unrest versus the more pejorative riot. The issue resurfaced this month because of the 50th anniversary of the Detroit riots, a riot based in civil injustice.
It began with a police raid on an after-hours bar filled with mostly black men and erupted into one of the deadliest riots in American history.
I took the 8mm camera because I wanted to see with my own eyes. And because what my parents were telling me was undescribable.
The violence tore the city apart, leaving 43 dead, hundreds injured, 2,000 buildings destroyed.
I said, this is not America.
Now, some 50 years later, not everyone agrees how to characterize those 5 days of terror. The Detroit Free Press, which uses riot in its editor's note, calls it both a riot and civil unrest in a headline. Its competitor, the Detroit News, uses terms interchangeably, writing, "The '67 Detroit uprising, many now call it a rebellion, while others still prefer labeling it a riot."
It's a war zone out there. They're destroying the city.
Now the new movie Detroit by award-winning director Kathryn Bigelow takes a sharp focus on those days that forever changed Detroit.
The movie, very broadly speaking, looks at the uprising, rebellion, riots, whatever you want to call it.
And Bigelow calls it for how she sees it.
Very broad canvas of the 1967 riots, and then begins to telescope down to a very specific event.
A specific event of civil injustice that stemmed from a riot.
Yeah, that was 3 young black men who were hiding out in the Algiers hotel and were murdered by police, and they pinned it on a security guard. I don't really have a problem using the term riot. I mean, when you look at the definition of it, it can sometimes mean something that has senseless nonsense to it. And there was some of that, a lot of the looting, like after the Rodney King thing, when Reginald Denny was pulled from that truck and beaten, I think almost to death or to death, I'm not sure. That's senseless violence. But this is a case where it was deeply rooted in civil injustice. And it was interesting going back and looking at that, because frankly, I had forgotten a lot. Detroit was so convinced it was going to bypass that era, that it wasn't going to happen to them. And then that one incident where the cops go in and bust up an after-hours party essentially triggered it.
Well, we should say that, what has been demonstrated now by a lot of new films, including this one, will be the lead up to this, which is that the constant surveillance, the constant interaction with police, none of it which was positive. So it was really, to use language we've heard before, all it needed was a match to set this off. That's where people were. So I like to think about Martin Luther King's statement, which is a riot is the language of the unheard. So right there you have a definition of what the systemic racism that people were pushing against, and that's the people. And then the riot, of course, is referring to what happens with the property and the ensuing kind of violence in its wake. And so you have a bit of both of that, but the real issue is that people come to understand that it wasn't people that woke up on Tuesday and decided, I think I'll just, run around and, shoot at people and do something. That there was real history here, real devastating history for that community. And this unfortunately exploded in the way that it did.
Well, I would say that's why I have no problem with the use of multiple terms by multiple sources, because no one term is going to be able to do justice to the complexity that you just described. So use them all, right? Let different people take a different tack. Let the same media outlet use different terms depending on what they want to emphasize. And then it will maybe spark people to dive a little deeper, as you just did.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I guess when I think of the terminology, rebellion to me involves more of a structure in terms of an organized militia, an organized army that is trying to take control of government, things like that. So I would shy away from that. But again, like you said, there's no reason that journalists and academics and activists have to be using the same terminology all the time. And as you said, I was going to use the same Martin Luther King quote, but you can get it first. There is power to the word riot that communicates in a way that civil unrest does not. And I think that even activists who may want to claim the mantle of rebellion or uprising, they also should appreciate, I think, the power of the term.
Yeah, maybe uprising is the way to go. I don't know. The problem with riot is that there's something about it that it seems to be conveying a meaning that it was unprovoked and random.
Right.
And in the case of the Detroit unrest, it was neither unprovoked nor random. And as Josh says, the problem with rebellion makes it sound like there's some definite political objectives that they're trying to attain. And that really wasn't the case either. So I guess I come down on the same side as everybody, which is that multiple terminology probably makes sense in this case. And because there is no one word that fully sums up what happened.
I mean, these things often devolve, and I think that's what we saw in Detroit. We saw it in more recently in Baltimore. So while these things have a legitimate seed of unrest or injustice, they devolve, and then it becomes oftentimes senseless, like looting somebody's store or beating up a guy.
So there is a history of the misuse of this term. I'm from Louisiana, and I think back to one of the great injustices in American history, the Colfax Riot, as it is historically called, which was the murder of a large numbers estimate, but estimates vary, but up to over 100 African Americans in the days around after the Civil War. That was called the Colfax Riot because riot is the framing that the whites who controlled it were framing it as. Historians now refer to it more as the Colfax Massacre, which is more accurate. So these words have meaning.
I think it's good too that. I don't think anybody was disputing the use of the word riot in 1967. No. I think it's good now that we're thinking about what did this really mean.
Well, I just wanted to say that riot, of course, is pretty much always pejorative. And so the reason we're having this discussion is that we understand that there's a level of nuance and we need to think about that. I also want to point out that when other situations happen and journalists have a choice of words to use, my argument has been, and I've demonstrated here a couple of times, that the word usually chosen when the scenario is exactly the same is not pejorative. And that's what makes me crazy. So I'm happy to have this discussion, but I want to be clear.
Who has the famous line about one man's terrorist being another man's freedom fighter? I can't remember who the source of that is. And if the American Revolution had been lost by the Americans, we'd be calling it something very different.